Right now, as you watch from the comfort of your home, Russian bombs are falling on Ukrainian cities, destroying factories, homes, infrastructure, all of it very expensive to rebuild. At the same time, hundreds of billions of dollars of frozen Russian assets continue to be held by Western nations, enough perhaps to rebuild Ukraine's shattered economy. It's perhaps no surprise then that a whole lot of people have put two and two together and declared jackpot. In an era when Western funding for Kyiv is more uncertain than ever, the idea of confiscating frozen Russian assets and handing them over to Ukraine looks like a bit of an easy solution, one that will punish the aggressor while helping Ukraine stave off financial collapse. But is it really so simple? While there appears to be a narrow legal path to asset confiscation, it's one that's never been tested at this scale, a path that could lead the West to a moral solution to its funding woes, or could just as easily lead to a morass of unforeseen consequences. Consequences which could impact the entire world. When Russian tanks rolled over the Ukrainian border 2 years ago, one of the biggest shocks was not that the Ukrainians were able to halt their advance, but also that the West managed to get their collective shit together. Instead of the dithering that followed the 2014 annexation of Crimea, spring of 2022 saw a raft of measures designed to hurt the Kremlin.
We will limit Russia's ability to do business in dollars, euros, pounds, and yen.
Sanctions were slapped on whole sectors of the Russian economy. Important oligarchs were targeted. Perhaps most impressively, hundreds of billions of dollars in Russian central bank assets held in Western nations were frozen. Although the exact figure is unknown, the total most commonly reported in the media is $300 billion. Even for an economy the size of Russia, that is a significant sum. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough to convince Putin to turn his tanks around. Since the funds were frozen, the Kremlin has continued to unleash massive destruction across Ukraine. In November of 2023, the World Bank estimated it would cost $411 billion to rebuild the shattered nation once the fighting stops. Clearly, there's a strong moral case to therefore reserve those frozen assets for reconstruction, to ensure that Russia literally pays for the damage it has caused. For some, though, there's no point in waiting until the war has ended. Better, they argue, to give Ukraine the funds now when it needs them most, at a time when future American aid seems less certain than ever. And the most surprising part? Those voices are apparently winning. Even as Congress delays Ukraine aid due to fights over the southern border, that same Congress has been pushing ahead with legislation that would allow Joe Biden to confiscate Russian assets. On January the 24th this year, 20 members of the 21-person Senate Foreign Relations Committee voted in favor of the Rebuilding Economic Prosperity and Opportunity for Ukrainians Act, better known as REPO. This follows a similar bipartisan bill from the House Foreign Affairs Committee that would fulfill the same function. While the full House and Senate would both have to vote on any bill, and President Biden would then have to sign it, chances are REPO could sail through Congress. At the time of writing, that's yet to happen. But it may have by the time you get to watch this, and nor is it the only sign that the West is leaning toward asset confiscation. In late February, the G7 is meeting to plot a common course on the subject. Although not certain, there are strong signs that the leaders will back the seizures. So, now seems like the perfect time to dive into this issue in depth, to explore the practicalities as well as the pros and cons of such a move. But first, you might have an obvious question. Why does the West have $300 billion of Russian assets in the first place? Now, most central banks keep part of their reserves in liquid assets, with Reuters giving examples such as major currencies, gold, and government bonds. On the day Vladimir Putin ordered his full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russia's central bank claims these liquid reserves amounted to slightly over $600 billion. Now, some of that came in the form of gold held in Russia itself. A whole bunch was denominated in Chinese yuan and thus held in China. But about half of it came in the form of assets held in euros, US dollars, British pounds, Japanese yen, and other Western currencies. According to Reuters, Russia's central bank on the eve of the war held around $207 billion in euro assets, $67 billion in US dollar assets, and $37 billion in British pound assets. It also had holdings comprising $36 billion of Japanese yen, $19 billion in Canadian dollars, $6 billion in Australian dollars, and $1.8 billion in Singapore dollars. Its Swiss franc holdings were about $1 billion. This meant that they could be frozen by those countries in case of war, something Russia was evidently aware of. We can tell this by the fact that only around $6 billion of these assets were actually held in the United States. The vast majority were kept in Europe, specifically in Belgium, even more specifically in the Brussels-based clearinghouse Euroclear. Apparently, the Kremlin's assumption was that Europe had grown so fat on cheap gas that it wouldn't dare follow the United States in freezing assets. If that's the case, well, it was a spectacular miscalculation. Fast forward to today, and the US, UK, and multiple European states are clamoring to confiscate those assets. Now, before we get into what it would mean if they go ahead with the seizures, we want to zoom out and look at the bigger picture here, to situate this plan within its historical context, so you can appreciate just how giant a step it really is. Because depending on who you ask, such a move is either in keeping with international norms, or it's a great big leap into an unknown future. If you want what we'll call the pro-confiscation history of nation-state asset seizures, you could do worse than reading the Simon Hinrichsen piece in the Financial Times. In his article, Hinrichsen pulls examples from across the last 2 centuries to illustrate how, as he sees it, taking Russia's frozen wealth and handing it to Ukraine is both legal and has precedent. In the case of the United States, that includes multiple times America confiscated enemy property in wartime. The most obvious example is during World War II, when German and Japanese assets were frozen and later used for compensation. But others include the seizure of enemy property during World War I and the taking of Iraqi assets during the First Gulf War. As Hinrichsen explains, quote, "In 1991, President George Bush signed an executive order that transferred Iraqi funds held in US banks that would later help pay Iraq's war reparation, while Iraqi assets were again seized in 2003 under the Patriot Act." More broadly, his piece attempts to situate the idea within a wider historical trend that's been going on since the end of the Napoleonic Wars, one in which a reparations commission is convened after fighting stops to assess the damage and award the wounded party compensation. According to Hinrichsen's figures, most successful claims since that era have resulted in reparation payments equivalent to between 20 and 25% of the aggressor's GDP. With $300 billion being just below a fifth of Russia's GDP, he argues that the confiscation would be appropriate by historical standards. Of course, reparations are typically paid as part of a peace agreement once fighting ends. Hinrichsen's argument is that since Russia is unlikely to ever sue for peace, it's justifiable for the West to take what it can now. But that's far from the biggest problem from a historical perspective. No, that instead has perhaps been best articulated by Scott R. Anderson in Lawfare. Although not against the confiscation of Russian assets, he does point out that, quote, "While not entirely unprecedented, seizing a foreign government's assets is a step that Congress has rarely taken and that federal courts have not squarely addressed. The issue is that while the US has done this before, it has almost always been in the context of a conflict in which America was an active participant. World War I, World War II, and the Gulf War were all instances where the states that had their assets confiscated were at war with the United States. That, emphatically, is not the case today. For all the talk of Russia being at war with the whole West, Putin has been very, very careful not to start a kinetic conflict with America. So, given Washington and Moscow aren't technically at war, that leaves only 2 peacetime historical examples Anderson could find on confiscating state assets. One came in 1958, when the Eisenhower White House seized steel mill equipment that had been bound for Czechoslovakia but frozen when the communists took over Prague. The equipment was then used to compensate US nationals who'd had their Czechoslovak property expropriated. The second came in 2000, when Congress forced the Clinton administration to confiscate Cuban assets to use them to compensate Americans who'd lost property in the revolution. Now, hopefully, you can see the obvious issue with both examples. In both cases, assets were seized to pay back unlawful losses incurred by US citizens. Where Russia's frozen assets are concerned, no such thing is on the table. Rather, the plan is to use those funds to help fund Ukraine's government during wartime. Clearly then, the situation today is an extremely unusual one that, as a result, will require everyone to carefully weigh up a simple-seeming but painfully complex question: is it worth it? For those who champion confiscating the assets and handing them to Kyiv, there are obvious practical and moral reasons for doing so. The practical ones involve demonstrating exactly what happens when dictators screw around. As Republican Senator Jim Risch said of the mechanism allowing Biden to seize Russian assets, quoting, "This is intended to be a big hammer. It's intended to be a very new way of attacking a country that does not behave itself." On the morality side, there's the fact that Ukraine's people continue to suffer an unjustified widespread assault on their nation. Not only would the funds help keep the government solvent in wartime, but they'd also compensate the victims of Moscow's naked aggression. While issues of practicality and morality do play a part, more important might be the legality of such a move. Here, supporters of confiscation appear on firm ground. Russia's full-scale invasion has already been judged as breaking international law. In votes following the 2022 assault, majorities in the United Nations declared Russia's invasion illegal and demanded Moscow withdraw. According to the Financial Times, this means that, quote, the UN has already recognized that Russia should bear the legal consequences of its war, which includes reparations. Under international law, the EU and the US are justified in enforcing state countermeasures to confiscate Russian assets. Going a bit deeper, the database of international humanitarian law highlights what it calls Rule 150, which says that any state in violation of international humanitarian law must pay reparations for damages. In their words, the duty to make reparation for violations of international humanitarian law is explicitly referred to in the Second Protocol to the Hague Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property. It is also implied in the rule contained in the Geneva Conventions, according to which states cannot absolve themselves or another high contracting party of any liability incurred in respect of grave breaches. Now, put like that, it seems pretty clear-cut. But, as you won't be surprised to hear, others argue that things are not so straightforward. The Economist, for example, has noted that, quote, state assets are protected from seizure under international law. While it might be legal to seize the yachts and villas of individual oligarchs, taking assets of a central bank is a lot harder. Unfortunately, the only ways around this prohibition are all routes that Moscow can block. One is a vote in the UN Security Council, where both Russia and China wield a veto. Another, the magazine identifies as a judgment by the International Court of Justice, but that would require the Kremlin to take part in the case against it. Finally, you have confiscation as an act of reparations, but that would require the war to end and a peace deal to be concluded. Of course, this is extremely contested territory, and it's impossible for us to say who is in the right. All we know is that lawyers with way more qualifications than we have are passionately arguing both sides. One interesting argument currently getting airtime in the White House is that Putin's war represents an attack on the entire international system. Therefore, any country affected by damage done to that system retains the right to engage in countermeasures. The trouble is, the United States can't go after those assets alone, even when they're held in foreign branches of American banks. As Lawfare explained in its deep dive, the Justice Department already tried doing that once before during the Iranian hostage crisis of 1979 to 1981. What it found was that, to quote, any banks that complied and were later found liable for damages in foreign courts could in turn bring takings clause claims against the US government, putting much of the final bill on the US taxpayer. In other words, Washington could only consider such a move if it was in concert with all of its allies in the G7. As we're about to see, though, that's unlikely for a whole host of reasons. Back in 2012, the International Court of Justice heard a case with potentially wide-ranging implications for state immunity. On one side were Italy and Greece, the other, Germany. The hearing was convened to settle the responsibility of the German state to compensate victims of Nazi-era atrocities. In the end, the justices sided with the concept of state immunity, which may be why the idea that Germany would sign off on confiscating Russian assets today seems so remote. Were a new precedent to be set, Berlin would potentially open itself up to future legal action. But even if we imagine a world in which Germany was just cool with this, there are still good reasons why Europeans might feel queasy about asset seizures. The biggest of which is likely the reputation of the euro. After the US dollar, the euro is the world's second most popular currency, a reputation that the EU is justifiably proud of. However, the dollar's dominance is so total that the euro can't remotely compare. According to the US Federal Reserve, the US dollar is bought or sold in about 88% of global foreign exchange or FX transactions. The euro, by contrast, is bought or sold in a mere 31%. And no, your maths doesn't deceive you there. 88% plus 31% absolutely adds up to over 100%. As the Fed's website explains, percentages sum to 200% because every FX transaction includes two currencies. Anyway, the point is that the euro's second place position is both hard-won and also precarious. As Reuters puts it, European officials are concerned with the potential consequences for the euro currency. Investors might pull out of euro assets out of concern their money might one day be seized too. Now, this is something Washington has to worry about as well. One fear is that by confiscating Russian assets, Congress might contribute to de-dollarization and the rise of alternative currencies across the world. This would severely impact America's ability to use sanctions against hostile states in the future. But the reason that you don't hear much about this is because it's not that big of a worry. The dollar is so dominant that aside from the euro, there are almost no practical alternatives to using it. Here's the Guardian's take. There are few safe alternatives to the established financial system. Assuming the governments do become wary of keeping their assets in the US, Europe, or Japan, where else are they going to hold them? In the euro's case, though, that popularity is more tenuous, and European capitals wouldn't like to see it vanish in a puff of smoke because they confiscated Russia's assets. And speaking of European capitals, there's a specifically Belgian angle to this debate that's been causing worries in Brussels. So remember when we said that the vast majority of frozen Russian assets were kept in one clearinghouse, Euroclear? Well, Euroclear, in turn, has significant assets in Russia, to such a degree that were Moscow to confiscate them in retaliation, the company would face collapse. As one senior official warned Reuters, the EU cannot bail out Euroclear. Euroclear manages trillions, and its bankruptcy would be far more than the budget of the EU. To be clear, the official isn't saying that trillions of dollars belonging to Euroclear are frozen in Russia. That sum is just the amount that moves through the clearinghouse as it fulfills its function, not what it actually holds. Still, the clearinghouse's collapse would undoubtedly cause financial problems across the whole of Europe, nor would it only be Euroclear in the Kremlin's crosshairs. Moscow officials claim that Western investors have assets totaling almost $300 billion that are frozen in special Type C accounts within Russia. If the West moves ahead with confiscation, the threat is that Kremlin will do exactly the same. The difference, of course, is that these are private investors who hold money in Russia, while the assets frozen in the West belong to the Russian state. But it is a sign that Moscow has options in case the confiscation plan goes ahead, which may be why it's looking increasingly unlikely to happen. Yet that doesn't mean that the West won't find some way to use the money to help Ukraine. In fact, European leaders may already have a plan. As of the time of writing, on the 2nd of February, it's clear that Ukraine is facing grim financial headwinds. Although the EU recently signed off on a €50 billion lifeline, further US aid to Ukraine remains stuck in Congress. While it's possible the funds will have been unblocked by the time you watch this video, it does seem unlikely. And even if they have, the understanding is that this will probably be the last generous American aid package for a long while, if not forever. For this reason, asset seizure has become a bipartisan plan to rally around. An idea that's seen as a way of ensuring Ukraine keeps getting funded without US taxpayers having to pay another penny. Yet while financial aid to Ukraine is a hugely pressing issue, we've already seen the potential flaws with such a move. Although they may be flaws that can be overcome, there's no doubt that some major governments are wary of the precedent that it would set. Hence the attempt to find reasonable workarounds. The most workable of which may be the European plan to avoid seizing Russian assets and instead just tax the living shit out of them. Since the money got frozen in Euroclear, the clearinghouse has invested it and made mad profits. According to The Economist, it pulled down €720 million of pre-tax profits in the first quarter of 2023 alone. This is profit that Euroclear is making purely because it happened to be the one holding the assets when they got frozen. Such a windfall isn't a part of their normal business model, which is why European leaders are now floating a plan to tax those profits at nearly 100%, a move that would be completely legal. The money earned from Russian assets could then be sent straight to Ukraine without potentially breaching international law or scaring investors off the euro. The major downside of that plan is that compared to what Kyiv needs, the profits generated by Euroclear's holdings are tiny. The general estimate's around $3 billion a year, barely a rounding error on the aid package held up in Congress. But, as The Economist writes, at a minimum, Ukraine could be assured of a recurring stream of income worth 2% of its present GDP. As a one-off, this is peanuts. Received each year in perpetuity, it is well worth having. For EU leaders, this appears to be the compromise they're willing to offer, which isn't to say that 20% of frozen assets held outside Europe can't be confiscated by the US, UK, Canada, and Japan, and so on, but outright seizure seems to be a red line for Brussels. Now, it's possible to see this not as a solution, but a pathetic piece of misplaced caution. In a late January podcast for War on the Rocks, site founder Ryan Evans can only be described as a rant about Europe's short-sightedness in not confiscating Russian assets. And who knows? It could be that he's right. When the history books are written, it may be that the leaders of Europe's largest economies are remembered as spineless weaklings too scared to stand up to Putin. As former World Bank boss Bob Zoellick acidly put it, if Western countries are bold enough to send weapons that kill Russian soldiers, it is odd to regard transferring Russia's assets to Ukrainian victims as too risky. Still, we have to deal with the world that we live in, and that's a world in which the leaders of nations like Germany and Belgium are extremely unlikely to confiscate all $300 billion in Russian funds trapped in the West. Given that salient fact, isn't it better that Ukraine at least gets something, even a relatively small amount, rather than nothing at all? It's a question which we don't have an easy answer to. As this video has hopefully shown, the possible seizure of Russian central bank assets is a legal minefield, one filled with dangers, one that has the potential to just blow up in everybody's faces. But it's also one through which a potential safe route might run, a safe route that could lead to the preservation of tens of thousands of Ukrainian lives. Because for all of this talk of legality, we should never forget that it is Russia that is breaking the law here. Russia, which launched an unprovoked genocidal war on a smaller neighbor and is now angry about possibly paying a monetary price. Whether that justifies the dramatic step of asset seizure is something only our leaders can decide.